Hey, welcome back to the channel. It is time for episode 4 of our read-along of Donald Ray Pollock's Knockemstiff. So welcome, good evening. If it's evening where you are, it's evening where I am. And why don't you sit down, get comfortable, and let's talk about this crazy-ass book. It continues to get crazier. Well, maybe not crazier, but I would say it's maintaining its craziness. And let's check out the first story, which is called Bactine. I didn't know what Bactine was, so I looked it up, and it is a medication to prevent infection. And we know our protagonist is getting high on it. But what's interesting about this story is we never learn our protagonist's name. It's all told in first person, and I kept waiting. Because we know Donald Ray Pollock. We've seen that plenty of times in these stories. He'll wait to tell us the character's name, but the character's name is never uttered. So I really wonder if we will ever learn this character's name. The fact that we don't know who this person is adds a level of interest, at least to me, maybe because it's a mystery. I'm not quite sure, but I did like that fact. It didn't bother me too much. I know some people are probably going to hate that about this, but that is for another discussion. Let's talk about this story. So we know he has been staying out around Masseyville with my crippled uncle because I was broke and unwanted everywhere else, and I spent most of my days changing his slop bucket and sticking fresh cigarettes in his smoke hole. So again, a very colorful introduction to a story, and I feel like every single one of these pretty much is like that. And we also know that this individual has recently got out of prison, or at least relatively recently, and he's kind of a piece of shit, like a lot of people in this collection of stories, and he's relegated to taking care of his uncle. And I love it when he says he just woke up. The driver was a hillbilly guy named Jimmy who kept calling me cousin, but I couldn't even remember meeting him, let alone seeing him at one of the reunions we used to have when our family was still permitted in the state parks. But anyway, these guys, they get up to no good. It is 3 a.m. They end up at the Krispy Kreme, which I wonder why they changed the spelling here. I don't know if it was called that at one point or this is sort of a copyright thing, but I thought that was kind of interesting. And they encounter a woman named Mrs. Leach, the cross-eyed waitress who always creeped me out because once in jail, I'd held her son in my arms. Wherever I went in those days, I stumbled across the bill collector's misfortunes of my past, while any chance of a future worth living kept spinning farther and farther away. So this guy is kind of a tragic story, as pretty much all of the characters are in this book one way or another. And they're just hanging out at this donut shop, this diner. And I like this line here. A radio in the back was playing a fast Christmas song that only religious people can understand. It's interesting. Again, I'm just constantly amazed at these little things he seemingly pulls out of the air, I guess. They just say so much because I know exactly what something like that sounds like. And they know that this Mrs. Leach was the mother to a man named Lester, but our protagonist knows, "What the fuck's the matter with you? Don't you know he's dead?" I said in a low voice, hoping the mom wouldn't hear. And we find out that that man, the son of this woman, is the one who hanged himself in the jail. Then our narrator goes on to give us the details of this death. Then without thinking, I said, "I was there when they cut him down." And this next line is great that I highlighted too. "It seemed that I always talked about shit that I didn't want to talk about, but I could never say the things I wanted to say." And then we get the details. "Had a trash bag wrapped around his neck," I added. I could still see the young deputy dropping his big key ring, screaming on the radio for backup. Before I knew it, I'd wrapped my arms around Lester's quivering legs and lifted him up, his piss soaking through the top of my orange jumpsuit. I was doing 10 shamefaced days for shoplifting a lousy package of cheese, and for a brief second or two, I saw saving him as a chance to prove that I was better than that. But when the deputy ran down the stairs, I grew confused, then limp. I hoped nobody would know the difference. The day before, Lester had pushed a pencil up his dick. It was his greatest accomplishment. I'll never forget the way he kicked when they let him go. And next up, we have the glass door swinging open and two big homely women walked in looking guilty. What a great line. They were the kind of women who, out of sheer loneliness, end up doing kinky stuff with candy bars, wake up with apple fritters in their hair. More just amazingly interesting lines Donald Ray Pollock comes up with here. And then Jimmy, he wants to get with him. He's interested. He's very interested in this. When it says, Jimmy leaned back in the booth, eyeing them like a desert sheik buying a keeper at a white slave auction. "Well, well, well," he said. "No way," I told him. "Shit, I ain't had none in a month. I'd blow the top of that one's head off." So Jimmy, he's pretty desperate here. He's eager, although we don't really know what Jimmy looks like whatsoever. But this line here, she packed in a pair of those stretch pants that overweight people should be thrown in prison for wearing. And I think we all know what those pants look like. And this part stood out to me because we finally learn what we look like. Well, what our protagonist looks like, the narrator here, when he talks about his teeth. Because he's like, hey, I'm too good for these women. And then Jimmy responds, well, your teeth and all. You'd be doing good to screw that old girl. You ain't exactly Len Campbell. And this pissed him off. He grabs him across the table, pulls him, and chokes him until his tongue pops out, and then shoved him back down to the booth. And we learn that a man named Tex Colburn attacks him. By the time he ran down in that cornfield, he was so pissed that he had his boys hold me while he chipped my front teeth out one by one with a spike nail he pulled out of a rotten fence post. I think that gives us enough to understand what this guy's teeth look like. And every time he flinched, he cut his lips. Now he's at the mercy of a welfare dentist who spent his office hours at the clinic trading spit with a volunteer eye doctor. And after this little aside, we get an interesting image here. He sees Jimmy, who is busy pouring sugar out of one of the dispensers and dividing it into two lines with a coffee spoon. And I highlighted that because it's something that I've seen, not specifically, but you know when you're sitting at a booth, you start messing around with a straw paper or something like that. I just love the specificity of this. Again, I think there's so much great specificity in his writing, but it's completely relatable. Someone doing this pointless task just to kill the time. And finally, we know our narrator gives in to exactly what he's always been doing. So nothing really momentous happens in this outside of self-realization, perhaps, that he just isn't that great. You know, we have that brief moment where he describes trying to save this man's life in jail because he wants to prove to himself that he's better than that. But again, in true Donald Ray Pollock fashion, we have some amazing last lines. I decided to ignore him. Besides, what was there to say? Because of who we were, I already knew what we would do. In a few minutes, Jimmy and I would leave this place and go find somewhere to park in his filthy car. He would fill up the plastic bag again with Bactine, and I would sit and listen to him suck the cold fog down into his lungs. The smell of it would sicken me, and I would crack the window. The snow would slowly cover the windshield. Jimmy's eyes would turn as red and sticky as candy, and his head would fall back against the seat in a dream. If you were lucky tonight, maybe you would see something that he hadn't seen before, and then it would be my turn. So what's interesting about this story, to me anyway, it's someone who is trying to be better. They're trying to change. They have a different image of themselves. So we know that for a couple of reasons. The first one is the memory we got of our narrator trying to save Lester in the jail because he wanted to prove to himself that he was a better man. But we know in reality, he's got nothing better to do, or he has no point other than taking care of his uncle and doing drugs. And then also we know he's self-conscious about his teeth when he thinks he's too good to be with these women. And Jimmy, his alleged cousin, says, well, you know, I didn't think you'd be that great with women considering your teeth and everything. And in this last paragraph, he just kind of concedes. He understands who he is. He knows he's no good, and he's kind of trapped. He's kind of lost in that. And that's what makes this story powerful, is it's a man who seems like he's hopeless but doesn't want to be that way. He thinks he's better than that, like a lot of people do. But he knows that he's just a prison to his addiction and to his nature, I guess. And maybe he's not willing to change, or maybe he has just come to accept the fact that he is who he is. Again, I really like the fact that we don't know his name, and I wonder if we ever will. It'll be interesting to see if we find out. But let us move on to a great story, another great one, called Discipline. And the discipline is uttered by a man who was once a bodybuilder, and like all fathers who want their sons to excel at a sport, or soccer moms even, he is reliving his youth or his glory, or trying to inject his glory into his son. The story opens with Sammy's dad injecting him with Deca for 425 American dollars. And he fixed up his son Sammy right there in the parking lot of Gold's, 1cc in the hip. And the first highlight I have here is remembering Randy from our story Fish Sticks, I believe, because it says remember Mr. South Ohio, and we know that Randy, before he died, was Mr. South Ohio. He was a successful bodybuilder, at least on that level. And this next part, I wondered if it was our Bobby, our beloved Bobby, from early on, from a couple stories, but I don't think it is, because I learned of the man's name. I had to actually go back to find out, because they do tell you Bobby Lowe's father's name, and it is not the same Bobby as the beginning, unfortunately. It would have been an interesting tie together, but once we know what Bobby's doing, it makes sense because we didn't feel our old Bobby on this trajectory, but I guess you never know in this set of stories. And right here, Bobby Lowe is standing out along the main drag doing a double bicep. It was the middle of December, definitely sweatshirt weather, but all he had on was a pair of radiant white briefs. Reminds me of Walter White in Breaking Bad in the opening episode, the pilot, when he's standing out. That's one of the best openings of a show I've ever seen. But it's called Extreme Posing, and I again laughed out loud when I was reading this. I pictured this guy out in the middle of the street. These two girls come up and kiss his biceps, and he's just posing in his underwear. And this is where I realize, unfortunately, that we're not dealing with our other Bobby, because Willard is this man's name. And these guys were always in competition. And so, you know, as we have a rivalry going on here, Luther, Sammy's dad, just wants his son to be the best. And one thing I noticed throughout the story is the title used throughout. No discipline at all. You fucking faggots are all the same. No discipline at all, I said. Don't talk that shit no more. He's just showing off like he's some little punk in school. And he repeats that over and over. It's almost like a mantra in a way. And this is where we get the description. I thought it up myself. He started explaining, extreme posing. That's what I call it. The more fuck the situation, the better. Shit, I even got ESPN willing to come down and take a look. We're talking big money here, Luther. And so we know here that this Bobby is riling him up. And this was funny too when he's talking about his genetics, his son's genetics, where he had taken after his skinny-ass mother, just a little bird of a thing who kept sneaking cigarettes and coffee until the cancer got her. And I kicked myself for 1,000 times for not knocking up some fat-ass Amazon with big bones. And this next highlight here describes someone who is remembering their glory days. Nobody disobeyed Luther Colburn. I had 21-inch arms and a 54-inch chest. He's just trying to live through his son, and unfortunately, we know exactly how that ends. We see that his son is trying to make his dad proud because he finds him. As soon as I walked around the corner, I spotted him, my stupid son. He was standing across the street under the Mickey D sign in his posing trunks, a pair of women's panties hanging on his head. The town was in an uproar, even worse than the week they put on the Farmers Festival. Bobby Lowe would hit a pose, and Sammy would copy him. So these guys are both up there with the whole town. You know, it's bigger than the farmer's market, and they're just honking their horns, admiring these two guys, laughing at them. And I don't know, maybe Sammy is trying to make his dad proud, but we know how it ends. When he witnesses this, then I saw it. It stretched across his face, gleaming like a toothpaste ad. I'd never realized Sammy could smile like that. It was like seeing his mother all over again. But then, just as I started across the street, dodging the cars and cursing the fucking drivers, he swung around to do a full frontal and dropped to the sidewalk. And still, his dad is in shock. You're shitting me, I said as a chunk of bloody glass fell out of my head and landed on the rubber floor mat. Do something, goddammit. And even though his son is dying here, what does he say? Jesus Christ, that boy's the next South Ohio, I said, grabbing the man by the throat. He's got a smile that can beat the world. He can't be dead. I shut off his air, watched as the veins in his eyes started to burst, and then I suddenly turned him loose. I'm sorry, I told him, but that's my boy. We find out that he suffered a heart attack from this paramedic. Mr. Colburn, your son suffered a heart attack. He had hypothermia, and his cholesterol was, he glanced down at his clipboard, 600 to be exact. Was he on medication? I shook my head. No, he was healthy as a horse. Shit, you saw him. And then what does the old man do? Well, in a way, he kind of memorializes his son, pays respects to his son. I have no idea, or maybe realizes that he's the only one that can do this. And he says, fuck off, I said, grabbing my coat. Then I called a taxi and went back to the gym and stiff-legged deadlift until I passed out. When I woke up the next morning, I was curled up on the platform with shit in my pants. And then what happens next? He gets news of a very, very cold day. Record lows even. And his head suddenly became as clear as a Ziploc baggie. I pulled on some old sweats, ate some aspirin. After sticking a stack of Sammy's Megadeth CDs in the stereo and cranking it up, I just started doing set after set after fucking set. Pumped iron for 8 hours straight, a personal best. Then around 2 a.m., took a scorching shower, shaved all of my body hair, and greased myself down. And he goes out into the cold, ready to pose. He started off with some basics, going through them slowly, trying to warm up. Then I went into some secret stuff that I'd been working on for years. Shit I was going to show Sammy when he was good enough. The wind cut across my naked body like a meat slicer. Staring across the bank sign, I kept sucking the icy air and praying for the discipline. There it is again. To hold each pose perfectly. The temperature finally bottomed out at minus 36 degrees. My muscles ground against each other like ice flows in the cold silence. As morning approached, I lifted my frozen arms for one more shot A loud crack shook my entire valley. A white light exploded in my head, and my body shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces. Then I blew like flakes of dirty snow down the gray, empty street. What's interesting about that is we know this guy collapsed, most likely died, but then we pull the camera back, and we get this information that he couldn't possibly know because he's dead. When it says, his body shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces, and then I blew like flashes of dirty snow down the gray, empty street. So that's kind of an interesting thing to do, because normally when we're talking about first person past tense or third person past tense, we know our narrator is surviving because we are being told the story by a survivor. Presumably, there's other novels that have broken that rule to a degree or another, but this one's interesting because we kind of changed to omniscient in a way. It's still in first person, but we're getting information that he doesn't possibly know. And so that was a cool kind of technique to avoid the problem of telling a first person story and the character surviving. Because I've heard people say that, have problems with that. They're like, oh, I don't like to read first person because I know the character survives. And I always thought that was kind of a dumb excuse because, you know, it's about the journey, not the destination. But here we go. Mr. Pollock, he solves it for you. You can still kill your first person narrator and finish the story. Finally, let us move on to our final story of the evening, Assailants. And we know who this man is. This is Delbert. We met from Fish Sticks. So standing in his underwear in front of the faded pink duplex that he and Geraldine rented, the Fish Stick girl, Del came out of a blackout while taking a leak in the dead of August grass. And I think there's like an old woman here who spots him. Yeah, he didn't even realize it was daylight outside until he looked up into the shocked eyes of two old ladies standing on the sidewalk staring at him. And this story tells us the tale of Geraldine, and they have a child together finally. They live below some nurses, if I remember correctly. This first highlight tells that story. So he'd first met Geraldine when she was living in the group home over on 4th Street. Back then, she did sex in public places, carried cold fish sticks in her purse the way other people pack chewing gum, handing them out to strangers like precious gifts. And then Del had gotten her pregnant, and in one brave, ecstatic moment, Geraldine flushed all her pills. And Geraldine catches him. "What the hell?" she said. "The whole friggin' neighborhood's watching us, for Christ's sakes." Sickly dark circles surrounded her cloudy eyes like little motes. Sometimes Del envied her. He couldn't get a doctor within 50 miles of Meade, Ohio, to put him on anything. "I must have been sleepwalking," Del mumbled. Then he staggered on and flopped down on the itchy plaid couch. And this next quote here, on those nights, let me go back a little bit. Every time he got lucky, Del stared at the ceiling and listened to the squeaking beds above him, half expecting the entire orgy to crash down on his head any second. On those nights, he held his dick in his hand like a holy cross, praying for their hearts to burst into pieces so that he could get some sleep. I didn't quite know what that meant. I love the line. But I was thinking about it. I'm like, how do you hold it like a holy cross? And why that? I mean, is he excited? I'm not quite sure. And it is time for Del to babysit his daughter. But I also highlighted this because we know who Porter is. We met him way back in the lard episode, or the lard story. "It's cleaner than the last batch," Porter assured him, handing him a joint laced with angel dust. So now we're even connecting more of these characters together, even though this is the only mention of Porter in this story. Geraldine is going out, and so Del has to babysit. And while he's changing his daughter, he finds there at the bottom of the carton lay a small cache of fish sticks wrapped in a greasy paper towel. He stared at the brown, crumbly wafers in disbelief. Geraldine hadn't touched a fish stick since he'd become a legal guardian. It was part of the agreement. And then Del puts his daughter to bed, and he sat in front of the window fan eating slices of white bread and watching the TV with the volume turned low, listening to the nurses party upstairs. He waited impatiently until he figured Geraldine was asleep, then stole the few dollars she'd managed to stick in Venus College Fund. Man, what a piece of shit guy. Then he goes to a convenience store, and he sees this strange-looking man hitting on the cashier. And then he remembers him. He saw him on like a training video at his job. And then something interesting happens. This is really when the story turns, when he says, "Hey, I'm serious," Del said. "What about the woman who got attacked down there by the cigarette store? They never did catch the guy." The clerk gave a little laugh. "Yeah, but that woman was some kind of nutcase, homeless person or something," she said, handing Del his change and sticking the beer in a bag. "She used to come in here with all this rotten food in her purse, trying to give it away. Believe me, she was like totally gross." And this pisses him off. I didn't quite get it immediately that she was talking about his wife, but we find out pretty quickly after that when he says, "That's bullshit what you just said," he said angrily, his back to the clerk. "That woman? She's married to some guy I know. He stared out into the illuminated parking lot, empty except for his old beater. He pushed the door open. They even got a little baby, Del added, his voice on the verge of cracking. And down here, he sat there trembling, thinking about what the girl had said about Geraldine. You think you're scared of a fat man? You just wait, he said out loud. Then pulling the beer out of the bag, he tore 2 ragged eye holes in the brown paper, and he could see the clerk inside, now sitting on a high stool, and he basically just slams on the window, and she dies. It seems like she falls back on the counter. Right here, the startled girl tumbled backward off the stool, banging her head against the sharp corner of the deli case. Del stood there for a moment in the humid night, his sour breath trapped in a bag, looking down at the still figure lying on the tile floor. Then he slipped his wedding ring back on, walked quickly to his car, and drove home. So another interesting exploration of character here. We have a man named Del who isn't very happy with his wife. He's in a shitty situation. He's got a child. And for a moment there, he thinks he's going to hit on this girl. He slips his wedding ring off, and he's talking her up, and then she talks shit about his wife, and he snaps back into kind of that ownership of her, or he's discovering his love, because again, we have somebody on the outside looking at them. All of these people seem to view themselves one way, and they don't realize what they really are. And here we see that again when she insults his wife, and he comes back banging on the window and then essentially killing her. Out of this batch, I would have to say Discipline was probably my favorite. It just was really, it seemed like a commentary on parents who were driving their kids to death, essentially, pushing them in sports, trying to make them greater than maybe they were at one point, just so they could relive these days. And indeed, that one does drive a child to death, and then the father dies too. And it was a great kind of fast-paced, full circle kind of story. And he was really unfazed by his son's death. It was all about the glory, all about the discipline. And what I liked about Bactine was it's kind of a mysterious man. You never know who he is. And very similar to this final story here, he has a different impression of who he is, what he looks like, and he's self-conscious about it. Just like Del here, when this young woman insults his family, he takes offense to it. So another good batch, another great batch. Let's see, what do we got coming up next here? Another 3 is going to take us into Rainy Sunday. Holler. Okay, well, I've heard that word quite a bit. I'm glad to read a story about it. And I start over. Well, that is it for the video. Hope you enjoyed the little discussion. Continue the discussion in the comments, or join our Discord if you're not already there. And let's talk a little bit more about these. I think there's a lot to unpack here, but hopefully this was enough of a conversation starter. Let me know if there's anything I missed, and I look forward to talking about the next 3 next week. Rainy Sunday, Holler, and I start over. So thanks for hanging out with me. Thanks for reading along with me, and I will see you next week. Thanks. Bye.